May 2nd, 1945, 6 a.m. Somewhere beneath the burning streets of Berlin, in the darkness of the U-bahn tunnel near the Friedrichstraße station, a young man by an SS commander who believed in fighting to the end, who saw the sacrifice of German civilians as an acceptable price for slowing the Soviet advance. Then the flooding was a final act of ideological murder, the regime killing its own people in a gesture of spite and desperation. If the order was given by a military commander who genuinely believed that denying the tunnels to the enemy was necessary for the defense of the remaining German positions, then the flooding was a tragic but defensible military decision. The kind of decision that soldiers in all armies have sometimes had to make. If the breach was accidental, to breathe, I saw them go under. I couldn't help them. The current was too strong, and I was fighting just to keep myself above water. I grabbed onto a railing and held on while the water rose around me, and I watched men drown a few meters away because I couldn't reach them. The water stopped rising when it was just below my chin. I stood there for hours, holding the railing, waiting for the water to go down or for someone to rescue us. People around me died while I stood there. Some drowned, some just let go and slipped under, too tired or too hopeless to keep holding on. When the water finally went down, I walked out through tunnels that were filled with bodies. They lay everywhere, on the tracks, on the platforms, in the alcoves where they had been sheltering. Some of them were still alive, barely, and there was nothing anyone could do for them. I never talked about this for years. I couldn't. Who would want to hear such a story? Who would believe it? Even now, telling you, I feel like I'm describing something that happened to someone else, something from a nightmare rather than from my own life. But it happened. I was there. I saw it. And I have never stopped seeing it. Another survivor, a woman named Elsa Hoffman, gave testimony to an East German historical commission in 1961. I was in the tunnel with my mother and my grandmother. We had been there for 3 days, waiting for the battle to end. My father was somewhere in the city, we didn't know where, and my brother had been killed in the east the year before. When the water came, my grandmother couldn't move fast enough. She was 72 years old, and her legs didn't work well anymore. My mother tried to help her, tried to carry her, but the water was too strong, and my grandmother was too heavy. My mother told me to go. She said she would stay with my grandmother, that they would find another way out, that I should save myself. I didn't want to leave her, but she pushed me away, and the crowd carried me with it, and I never saw her again. I found out later that they both drowned. Their bodies were recovered after the water went down, and they were buried in a mass grave somewhere in the city. I don't know exactly where. I've never been able to find it. I was 19 years old when this happened. I am now 35. I have a husband and 2 children. I have a life. But I have never stopped feeling guilty for leaving my mother and grandmother behind. I know I couldn't have saved them. I know that. But the feeling doesn't care about what I know. It's just there all the time, like a weight I can never put down. The party tells us we should remember this as a crime of the fascists, another atrocity committed by the Nazis against the German people. I don't think about it that way. I don't think about politics or ideology or historical interpretation. I think about my mother's face when she told me to go, and my grandmother's hands reaching for something to hold on to, and the sound of water in the darkness. That's what I remember. That's what I'll always remember. The tunnels were pumped out in the weeks and months after the war ended. Soviet troops, now occupying Berlin, organized the recovery effort. They brought in pumping equipment and began draining the flooded sections, exposing the bodies of those who had died and the debris of the lives they had been living. The scene was hellish. Bodies lay everywhere, on the tracks, on the platforms, tangled in the equipment and debris that the water had swept through the tunnels. Many were unrecognizable, distorted by days of immersion in cold water. Some were still clutching possessions they had refused to abandon. Photographs, jewelry, the small tokens of identity that people cling to even in the face of death. The recovery teams worked for weeks, removing bodies, cataloguing what could be catalogued, burying what could not be identified. The work was emotionally devastating, and many of the workers, both Soviet soldiers and German civilians pressed into service, suffered psychological consequences that lasted for years. The final count of bodies recovered from the tunnels was approximately 2,000, but this number was certainly incomplete. Some bodies had been swept through the tunnel network to locations that were never searched. Others had been buried under debris or caught in inaccessible sections of the tunnels. Still others had been removed before the official recovery effort began, carried away by survivors who wanted to bury their own dead. The true death toll will never be known. Estimates range from a few hundred to as many as 15,000, depending on the assumptions used and the sources consulted. The most commonly cited figure, around 3,000, is a reasonable middle estimate, but it is not based on hard evidence. It is simply the number that most historians have found plausible given the fragmentary information available. The tunnels were repaired and returned to service in the years after the war. The U-bahn and s-bahn systems were essential to Berlin's transportation infrastructure, and the city could not function without them. The sections that had been flooded were pumped out, cleaned, rebuilt where necessary, and reopened to passengers who had no choice but to use them. Today, millions of Berliners and visitors ride through the tunnels every year. Most of them have no idea what happened there in May 1945. There are no plaques, no memorials, no indication that this underground space was once filled with water and death. The trains pass through stations that were once shelters for the desperate, and the passengers look at their phones or read their books or stare out the windows at the darkness, unaware of the history that surrounds them. This forgetting is not unique to the tunnel flooding. It is characteristic of how cities deal with traumatic histories. The past is buried beneath the present, overlaid with new construction and new life, rendered invisible by the passage of time and the needs of the living. Berlin has done more than most cities to acknowledge its past. There are memorials and museums throughout the city, marking the sites of Nazi crimes and the destruction of the war. The Holocaust is remembered in stone and bronze and carefully preserved ruins. The wall is remembered in painted lines on the pavement and preserved watchtowers. But not everything can be remembered. Not everything is commemorated. Some histories are too diffuse, too difficult, too resistant to simple narratives of guilt and victimhood. The flooding of the tunnels is one of these histories. It was a crime, or it was a military necessity, or it was an accident. It was committed by the Nazis, or by the Soviets, or by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Its victims were innocent civilians, or they were people who had supported the regime, or they were simply human beings caught in a situation they couldn't escape. The ambiguity makes memorialization difficult. How do you create a memorial when you don't know who to blame? How do you honor the victims when you can't count them or name them? How do you tell a story when the story itself is uncertain? Perhaps the uncertainty is part of the story. Perhaps the lesson of the tunnel flooding is precisely that war creates situations in which responsibility becomes impossible to assign, in which the line between perpetrator and victim becomes blurred, in which everyone is caught in a current too strong to resist. The water came, people died. The survivors lived with what they had seen. The dead are forgotten by everyone except those who loved them. That is what happened in the tunnels beneath Berlin in May 1945. That is all we can know for certain, and perhaps that is enough. The tunnels still run beneath the city, carrying passengers to destinations they have chosen through darkness that conceals nothing anymore. The water is gone. The bodies are gone. The screams have faded into silence, but the ghosts remain. They ride every train that passes through those tunnels. They stand on every platform. They fill every car with their invisible presence, their unspoken stories, their unremembered names. They are the drowned. They are the forgotten. They are the dead who have no grave and no memorials and no one left to mourn them. They are there, even though no one sees them. They will always be there. The city goes on living above them,